what is a spool board? What's its purpose? And why do you need one? Well, that's what I'm going to hope to answer for you today. So stay tuned. Hi guys, so for those of you who don't know, my name is Michael and I am the woodworker for MK Designs, and yeah, today we're going to talk about spool boards and why you need them. If you're anything like me, you've got your CNC, you've got it all set up, you want to dive into learning the software and you want to start cutting something so you can start making money on it. Take a deep breath, slow down, and just make sure you take the time to make sure it's set up exactly right. And a spool board is one of those accessories that, yes, you don't necessarily have to have it, but there's a lot of good reasons to have one. And what a spool board does is it gives you a replaceable surface on the top of the bed of your machine. And you can surface it and multiple times. That's a good spool board. You don't want one that you just surface once and then you have to just replace it. You actually want one that you can surface multiple times, because as you go through and as you cut things, you're going to dig into the spool board a little bit. And especially when you're first learning, you're going to dig into it quite a bit. And so you want one that you can resurface and have a good clean surface to go back over the top of. This particular spool board is from Next Wave. They just released this, and in my opinion, it's really good. I mean, it's 3/4 inch MDF when you get it. After you service it, obviously it's a little narrower. It's all solid black, colored MDF, so no matter how many times you service it, it's going to stay black. The installation is very easy, and they even give you installation instructions on how to actually line these things up where they need to be for the machines. They have these available for all of their HD machines, the HD 500, the 510, and the 520, and I figured I would just showcase this for you just in case it's something you might want to lean towards. You can obviously make your own. I make my own sometimes as well. There's a couple different options you can go through on for your spool board. You can have something like this where it's just a piece of MDF with holes screwed in it and to hold it down, or whatever your machine bed is, you just have the hold downs in there for it to hold it down. And then you would surface it, and if you want, you can put a grid on it like I did, and I'll go over that here in just a few minutes. But there's multiple types of spool boards you can have. I like this design, and this is when I make my own, this is similar to how I do it as well. Because I can get my clamps, let me grab one real quick. I use these types of hold downs. And you can see it's a T-bolt and just a clamp, but I can actually slide this up between these and clamp up here. I don't have to clamp only on the edges. There are people that they have a smaller machine, or everything they're doing, they clamp on the edges like so, and so they would just create a solid spool board. And there have been people that have put T-track in the middle of their spool board, and also you can get threaded inserts and get straight bolts instead of these T-bolts to screw these clamps down into the inserts and hold down in the middle as well. There's a few other things you can do. There's a lot of things you can do with the spool board, and I'll go over some of them in another video. But this is just about what is a spool board, why do you need it, and how do you make one. So why do you need a spool board? Well, for one, you want to protect the bed of your machine. I mean, I've even got a couple of gouges from when I first started. And they're not deep and they don't affect anything, but the bit went a little bit too far and bit into my bed. And I was able to catch it in time, so it didn't do any real damage. But right underneath the spool board, there's two little divots where a 1/4 inch bit went down and just cut straight into the machine. And again, a lot of times when you do, especially when you're cutting through your material, your bit will go, if you don't have the exact thickness of your material, let's say you have a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, for example. We all know that 1/4 inch plywood is not exactly a 1/4 inch. You can take a pair of calipers to it and measure it and set your cut up for that depth, but plywood is not always the same thickness throughout. It varies even a 1/16 to a 32nd of an inch in thickness. So you start cutting down here on a sheet, and it cuts just fine, cuts all the way through, but doesn't cut into your spoil board or your machine bed. But then you get up here and it's a little bit thinner, and it cuts down a little bit lower. Technically, if you set your Z to the higher position, it won't do that. However, you can't always guarantee that you can do that. So you want to have something like this to protect your bed just in case you wind up going through. So a few other reasons why you might want why you want a spoil board. Again, it protects your bed. Any machine, it has an aluminum bed. Most of them are going to have an aluminum bed, and so it protects that. It also allows for higher tolerances because when you surface it, you're actually making 100% positive that your bed is coplanar to your router. And when you go to surface the spoil board, sometimes you might see some little lines and whatnot, little ridges, and that's because you need to tram your router. And basically what tramming is, I'll go over another video, but basically what tramming is you will adjust your spindle or your router to be perfectly coplanar to the bed of your machine. And then when you surface the spoil board, you get a completely flat surface that is completely coplanar. You don't have to worry about any defects. So you can actually put in tighter tolerances into your cuts, especially your 3D models and things, and know that it's going to come out like it should. And again, with a good spoil board, you can actually resurface it multiple times. Like this one, like I said, is 3/4 of an inch, and the bolts that hold it down are at least a 1/2 inch to 7/8 of an inch deep. So you can actually, depending on how thick how deep you go when you resurface the board, you can actually resurface this probably, I would say, up to 7-8 times before you'd have to replace it, maybe even more if you go a little bit shallower. I typically go a 1/64 of an inch at a time, but a lot of times I'll have to run 2 surfacing paths, so I'm taking a 32nd at that point, and then if I have to do it more, you get the idea. So it just depends on how deep you go on your surfacing as to how many times you can actually resurface one of these. Now, when you go to make your own, you can obviously make it thicker, but there's a few issues with that. Not really issues, but just concerns you need to keep in mind. Like the one I just recently made it's 1.5 inches thick. When I first made it, I can resurface that all the way down to 3/4 of an inch because of the way that I made it. However, I did need to get longer bolts for my hold downs, and a lot of times when I'm clamping, I have to clamp over here on the edge. The clamp will actually catch on the lip here, and it won't hold down my part. It'll lift up versus off the part versus. So I had to be careful about that. I had to be real cognizant of that. So that's the main advantages to this type of spoil board. And the one from Next Wave, like I said, it's very easy to install. Basically, you just put the bolts in, and I'll show you later in the video. Basically, you just put the bolts in and put the little T-nuts on the bottom, and then you just slide it into place, line everything up, and then you're good to go. And if for any reason you need to remove the spoil board, that's another thing you need to keep in mind for if you make your own. You want to make sure that you can slide it on and off easily without having to remove any of the hardware. And that's one of the beauties of this is you just loosen up these bolts in here, and you can slide it off, and then when you're done, you can slide it back on. Why, you ask, would you ever need to remove it and then put it back on? Well, for example, if I go to use my 4th axis, I will need the extra depth from the bed, and I'm not having to worry about protecting the bed because the bit's going to be cutting up in this area here versus down on the bed. And I just want that extra depth to be able to, for it to be able to rotate like it needs to and do the cut that I want it to do. That's just one example. There's multiple reasons why you might need to remove it and put it back. Now, when you're surfacing your boards, you want to make sure you get a good smooth resurfacing. Like I said, if you get the lines on it, then you may want to check into tramming your router or your spindle. But another thing is you need to decide if you want a grid or not. The reason I have a grid, there's several reasons. One, it makes it really easy to be able to square everything up to my spindle. Basically, because I'm having the machine cut these lines, I know that this is a perfect straight line along my Y, and this one's a perfect straight line along my X, and they're at 1 inch increments. So I know that if I need to move over 2 inches, I just 1, 2, and I move it over. And if I line up my part to one of these corners, it is going to be perfectly square to my spindle. That comes in really handy when you're working on 3D carvings, or if you need something that needs to be exact. It comes in really handy because it speeds up being able to line it up. I mean, you can put it on there and you can take a square and you can get it lined up, squared up that way, but this makes it a whole lot quicker to do it with the grid. So I would recommend putting a grid on your spoil board, simply because you don't have to, but I recommend it simply because it does speed things up in the production sense. Now, one major advantage for me is a lot of things that I cut out of 2x4 pieces of Baltic birch or MDF, and I will cut multiples at a time. And I have my XY datum position in the software set to the center of my material. So I can take one sheet, line it up to this corner, and just make sure it's square, and find the center of that piece, and set my XY0 to that position. And then when that piece is done cutting, all I have to do is remove that one, and the next piece I put on, I line it back up to that exact same corner, and clamp it down and go. I don't have to realign the center. I don't have to find my XY again. It's all set, ready to go. So that is a major advantage. It cuts my setup time in half. So that's why I recommend putting the grid on. So with all that said, how do you make a spoil board and how do you install it? So let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing I need to do, obviously, is create the spoil board, and the way I'm doing that is I laminated a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and a piece of 3/4 inch MDF together, and then any squeeze out, I use a scraper and a sander to get it back flush and take care of the squeeze out. This is obviously not Baltic birch. This is what my hardwood dealer calls Craftsman birch, and it doesn't have any voids in it, but it doesn't have as many layers as Baltic. To me, it's just as good. It's less likely to warp. In the past, I have glued 2 pieces of MDF together and used that as my spoil board, but I have found that even here in Colorado, the MDF takes on the moisture and it winds up getting no longer flat and true. So I'm trying this with the plywood and the MDF because I had someone recommend the plywood to me for the base, saying that would make it more stable and it wouldn't flex as much with humidity changes. So that's that. Next step is to drill all the screw holes, or cut all the screw holes in it, and I'll show you how I do that. Now, before I start cutting, I need to get it lined up to where it's straight up and down on the bed of the CNC. And the easiest way for me to do that is I'm going to line it up with my existing spoil board right here along this edge. If you don't have a spoil board, you can use a framing square to try and get it lined up, and try to line it up with something that you know is going to be straight. It doesn't have to be dead on, but it does need to be pretty close. So I'm going to line it up and then we'll start cutting. Okay, so the way I did this was I set it up inside of Vectric software. I use Aspire, but you can also do it in VCarve Pro or desktop. If you guys are interested in how I set this up, let me know and I'll record a video on how I did this. But basically, I set it up in VCarve to cut out my clearance holes first, and then it'll go back and it will cut my bolt holes so I can run my bolts through it to be able to hold it down. I probably should have used an upcut bit on this, but I just grabbed the first 1/4 inch bit that I had and did it. And I have my dust collection, my dust boot removed so that you guys can see how this works a little bit better. And yeah, so that's how I did it. And I'm using the attachment on the end of my shop vac hose to actually pull the dust out so I can keep it clear so you guys can actually see what's going on here. But this is how I cut the holes. So now after all my holes have been cut, I am going to install the hardware. But before I install the hardware, I actually cut my spoil board down into 3-inch strips so that I can have space between each section of the spoil board. And as you can see, I'm just using a bolt and a T-nut. I'm using a flathead bolt and a T-nut. And sometimes the T-nuts don't really want to go in because the ones I got, they have the large lip on them. You can get ones with a smaller lip that will probably make this a whole lot easier. And the ones with that come with the Next Wave spoil board, they are smaller and they fit pretty nicely. But with these, essentially what I have to do is I have to get them kind of pressed in there a little bit, and then I start putting my screw in, and as I tighten it up, it pulls the T-nut up into the plywood on the bottom, and as it does that, after I install it, it pulls up on the T-track and secures the board to the bed of the machine. And then once I have all my T-bolts installed and my bolts and my T-nuts installed, then I will slide it in. And because I've already done this once before, I know approximately where I want it to go, and I'll show you how I get it lined up exactly where I need it here in just a moment. But essentially, I'm going to make sure all the T-nuts are lined up the right way and then slide it into one of the T-slots, and we'll go from there. And this is how I get it lined up. So I've installed a V-bit into my spindle, and I've brought my machine, my CNC machine, and my spindle down to my home position, which is the front left corner of the machine. And I bring the V-bit down to touch the bed of the machine, and then I just use some blue tape to mark the left side and the bottom where that V-bit is at, so I have that corner. And then I will move the spindle up out of the way, and I will slide the spoil board down to match that tape on the front and tighten it down from there. Now, once I have the first piece tightened down, I will go ahead and slide on the remaining 4 pieces. I have 5 pieces to mine, so I would put on the next 4, and then I will take my framing square and I'll line it up on the first piece, and that will allow me to get all 4 of the other pieces in a perfect line across the X axis in line with that first piece. And yeah, again, this is one of those steps that doesn't have to be perfect, but you need it pretty close to what you're actually wanting to accomplish in the end. Another option that you can do is you can actually purchase a spoil board from Next Wave. I don't know if other companies have it or not, but Next Wave just recently released this spoil board, and this is it. I'm going to pull it out and we're going to unbox it and see what all's in here, what all it comes with. So it comes with the hardware, so there's no additional hardware to have to purchase. It comes with it, and you got several bags of it. There's one more down here. There we go. All right, and this is for the 520. They have it for each of the different machines. They have one for the 500, the 510, and the 520 for all their HD machines. And it comes with the contents and an installation guide. So that would be something good to look at. And it comes with all the different slats. The spoil board is cut into slats. The holes are pre-drilled, and it comes with the hardware. It's solid black MDF, so you can service it multiple times and it'll stay black because it's colored MDF, not stained or painted. It is actually colored, so you can see that it goes, the coloring goes all the way through. And yeah, it's cut into slats, like I said. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these narrower ones, or excuse me, the wider ones, and looks like 4 of the narrower ones. And that's everything in the box. And so it pretty much assembles. It's the same way that I just did my own spoil board that I did. One of the advantages to this is it's not as thick, and so you don't have to worry about your clamping so much. Oh, and one issue that I ran into with the thicker spoil board, which means if I make another one, I'll probably go with 1/2 inch MDF and maybe even 1/2 inch plywood on the bottom. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to look at that. But at any rate, it's 3/4 inch MDF, black MDF, like I said, and so it's a little bit thinner, but it can be resurfaced multiple times because they've got the holes drilled pretty deep. I imagine there's 1/4 inch on the bottom. I haven't measured it, and that will allow you to resurface it multiple times. And like I said, with this particular one, if as you resurface it, it stays black. You don't have to worry about that going away. So let's get this thing installed and see how it does.
Okay, so the hardware is very similar to what I had. You have a bolt, and then you have a washer, and then you have the T-nut. And so you put the washer on the bolt, and then put the bolt and the washer combo through the hole, and then you'll attach the T-bolt or T-nut onto the bottom of it, and then you do that for all the holes, and then you'll slide it on just like I did mine. And they send instructions, and they show you exactly where on your T-track or on your bed, the bed of your machine, to slide all these into, so you get it lined up perfectly. You don't have to go and test and see what the extents of your machine are and things like that before you install the spoil board. They actually show you where to put them on these machines to get it lined up perfectly. Now, the instructions where they show you where to slide them into gets it lined up where you want it along the x-axis, but for the y-axis, you are going to have to do a little bit. So what you're going to do is you're going to put a V-bit into your spindle or your router, and you're going to bring the machine down to the home position, and you're going to bring the V-bit down to where it's just barely touching, or will just barely touch the spoil board, and you'll slide the spoil board to where the front end of it lines up with the bottom of the V-bit, and then you can just tighten up the first one, and then you can just line up the others just like I did before with using the framing square, and you've got it set on your y-axis now. That's all there is to it. Now, the easiest way to do it on the other end is you just take your y-axis to its extent, and then you bring the V-bit down, and you line up the back end of the second set with that one, and then just line the others up the same way with the framing square. It's just that simple. And now it's time to flatten or surface it. I am using a 2.5 inch spoil board bit from Whiteside. Now, I did record how I set these files up, and I'll release that in another video. This video is already getting too long, and so I didn't want to add that into it. So I will release it in another video here in the next few days. I do have my dust boot on this time because I am taking a lot of material off at one time, and it's MDF, so it doesn't really chip, it more dusts, and it just creates a huge mess. I mean, you'll see when this gets done that I have black dust just about everywhere. It would be 100 times worse, and the room would be filled with black dust if I didn't have my dust boot on. So I didn't leave my dust boot on for this part and for cutting the grid. And now it's going to cut the grid, and again, I'll show you how I set these up in the next few days with another video. But I'm just using a 90-degree V-bit, 1/2 inch 90-degree V-bit, and cutting about a 32nd of an inch down for the grid.
Okay, so as I said, it's really easy to install one of these things, and I'm grabbing this one. This is the one that I just made and installed. It's one of the slats for it, and as you can see, I've already cut into it on some of the things that I make, and it doesn't always do that. So yeah, like it'll cut here, but then it won't down here somewhere. And that's why you want to protect your bed, because you never know what might happen. You want to just protect everything. And I designed this to be able to slide on and off just like these do, but mine go the full length of my bed versus separated like this up here. And I actually kind of like this design a little bit better, because if I need to use just this section of the bed, I can leave these back here on and just remove these and then put them back as I need to. Or if I need just in this area right here, I can just take this one out, so forth and so on. So I kind of like this a little bit better, and I think when I make a spool board in the future, I'm going to emulate this design. And yeah, so again, when you go to surface the spoil board, if you feel ridges, you're going to need to tram your spindle or your router. And if you have this machine, or even if you don't have this machine, I'll put a link down below to Next Wave's tramming page. They walk you through how to actually tram this particular model, not even the 520, any of their machines really. But the steps in that are going to be very similar on any machine that you have. May not be exactly the same because they may use different connectors or different types of bolts, but it's going to be very similar to that. And so it may give you a little bit of heads up if the company that you got your machine from doesn't have a instruction page to be able to on how to do this. It'll get you in the right direction. I will be putting out a video on how I trimmed this machine, and I will also be putting out a video on how I created the tool paths for the surfacing and the grid pattern in Vectric software. So be looking for those. They'll be coming out real soon because I recorded all these videos at the same time but couldn't release them all at the same time. So yeah, this one's first and the other two will be coming shortly. So yeah, until next time guys, happy creating.